For many of you, I seem to be one of the most elusive people of all the New Testament. You know my name, Mary Magdalene. Names in my day weren't the same as yours today. Magdalene simply means that I came from Magdala, a village between Tiberias and Capernaum on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. People, it seems, are always getting me confused with all the other Marys of the New Testament, just like people confuse the many people with the name John in the Gospels. Probably the one I'm most confused with is Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who sat at Jesus' feet while Martha was busy preparing their dinner. Others have confused me with a woman of questionable character who came unwanted to anoint the feet of Jesus with costly ointment. I have even been confused with the woman taken in adultery when Jesus admonished the accusers that whichever of them was without sin should cast the first stone. One of your writers even dares to share that every one of these women were in fact me. Tonight I'm here to help you sort out which is which and to tell you a little more about me and what all happened to me. My experience with Jesus of Nazareth began with quite a dramatic encounter. You see, I was insane, possessed by demons. The talk around the village was that I was in fact possessed by seven different demons. Much of the time I was quite a normal young woman. Then all of a sudden, it was as if all the evil forces broke loose within me. Although I would never remember the experiences, people would later tell me I would scream and curse and rant and rave until I would have to be forcibly restrained. It often took 5 or 6 adults to hold me down. My parents, as you can imagine, were at their wits' end. They didn't know what to do. They'd tried all the physicians in the area and had certainly been praying about me for years, but nothing seemed to help. There was very little they could do but throw up their arms in despair. My father wouldn't even talk about it anymore. It seems that it was just too much for him, and he tried to pretend that it didn't even exist. When others would suggest possible solutions, he simply shrugged it off as a hopeless matter. I'm sure he felt that God had somehow cursed him. I remember one day overhearing a conversation between my mother and my father. Mother had heard of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, who might be able to help me. She said she had heard that he had healed others with similar problems. Father was outraged. He too had heard of this Jesus in the temple and was convinced that Jesus was an impostor. "What can a carpenter do to help our daughter?" he said. "Besides, there's talk in the temple that this Jesus is not only an impostor, but claims things for himself that only God can claim, that he is leading the people away from the teaching of the faith. I will not have anything to do with this Jesus. That is my last word." My mother's next comment was said rather quietly, for she knew what my father's reaction would be after that outburst. "I've already sent for him." My father walked out of the house in silence. One day we were interrupted by a servant who said there was a group of men outside. The servants told my mother, "They say you sent for Jesus of Nazareth." 3 men entered the room where I was. 2 of them were rough and weather-beaten like fishermen. The third had the physique of a laborer, but the face of an artist. His gaze seemed to penetrate far beyond his physical features. It was as if he were able to see right through the soul. At the sight of him, I felt my body contort, and the voice from my mouth was not my own. It was a deep voice of a man that said from my lips, "Leave me alone! Leave me alone, Son of God! Do not torment me!" The man Jesus spoke simply but forcibly. "Come out of her, unclean spirit." I felt my body shake uncontrollably, and then I collapsed on the floor. In a few minutes, I felt my breathing become more quiet, and it was all over. The nightmare was over. I knew at that moment I would be troubled by those spirits no more. Oh, my mother and father were skeptical, and they would have to wait and see if it were real. But I knew it was over. For the first time in years, it was over. After that, I became one of a group of women disciples who followed Jesus and shared his ministry. Many of the others had come from experiences just like mine. We helped any way that we could. We too went around proclaiming the kingdom of God. It was the least we could do for the one who had done so much for us, setting us free from the powers of evil to know the love of God. What a great experience to go from place to place with the Master, to hear his teaching, witness his healings, sense his compassion for those who needed him so badly. Some of you have been led to believe that maybe there was a kind of love affair between Jesus and myself. There certainly was nothing like what some of your plays and movies have depicted, but I must say I did love him in a very special way. There was no other man like him. His compassion and love for people, his dedication, his closeness to the Father, they were qualities that drew all of us close to him. You can't imagine the pain of having to follow the Master to that hill outside of Jerusalem called Golgotha, the place of the skull. What a cold and desolate name, and the place was deserving of the name. They had arrested Jesus, set up a mock trial, and condemned him to death. How anyone could treat Jesus the way they did was far beyond my wildest nightmares. When I saw his blood-stained and weak body trying to carry that cross, it was as if the life left my own body. I felt hollow. I wanted to scream at the injustice, the unfairness. Few seemed to notice or care. It was as if the evil spirits that had left my body years before somehow had gained control of the world, and this was the result. Everything was upside down. Nothing was right. We stayed at the cross. Most of the disciples had fled for fear of their own lives. Only John was left. We were sure the authorities wouldn't even take seriously the group of women, and so we weren't afraid of them. Some of the priests and others turned their scorn on us. "You, Mary of Magdalene," they said, "why don't you go home where you belong? Can't you see where following this blasphemer has gotten you?" It wasn't the first time Jewish men had yelled at us. Maybe that's why it didn't bother us. When they saw we weren't intimidated by their jeers and were intent upon staying, they tired of their own tirades. Some of the soldiers, however, didn't give up so easily. They began making rude and obscene remarks to us. Too many of them had too much of the pre-crucifixion wine, while one who was being particularly obnoxious began to try to grab at me, the centurion who was in charge of the man that came over. I had noticed earlier that the events of the day had visibly shaken him. I wondered about it since crucifixions were routine for these soldiers. He had kind of a strange expression on his face. He grabbed the drunk soldier, threw him to the ground, and ordered the others back to their stations. I didn't know why he had acted the way he did, but I was certain we would have no more trouble from the soldiers. When it was all over, a few of us stayed to bury Jesus. There were just us women and Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. We took the lifeless body of the one who had given us life down from the cross. We wiped him off as best we could and took him to Joseph's tomb, where the soldiers rolled a huge stone in front of the entrance. It was the saddest day of my life. In many ways, I wished I had never been born, but this could not take away from me the new life he had given me. Little did I know what would be in store for me just a couple of days later. I had heard the Master talking of his dying and rising, but none of us were able to comprehend what would happen. And so when I went to the tomb that morning, I had no idea of the events that would follow. I had intended to anoint the body with perfumes and spices, as was the custom of my day. With the Sabbath and Passover and all, I couldn't do it Friday. I knew it would do nothing to bring him back, but it was the least I could do after all he had done for me. The sun was just beginning to come up, and I could see the vanishing shadows that the stone no longer stood in front of the tomb. I'd wondered how I would ever move it, but hoped the soldiers would help me. After all, I was no threat to them. Immediately I ran back to the city to get Peter and John to tell them that someone must have stolen the body. The two of them raced to the garden. I couldn't keep up with them, but when we got back, I saw a man standing alone. I pleaded with him to tell me where they had taken the body of Jesus. I prayed he would know. I couldn't see his face as he was looking away from me. Without turning, he uttered one word, "Mary." It was as if 2 years had never happened. I was transported back to the room with my parents when I first heard the Master say my name, Mary. Now I could look into his face. I fell at his feet and cried, "Master!" Tears of joy rushed down my cheeks. Joy filled my entire being. Life once again entered my spirit. The world that had been turned upside down by the forces of darkness was once again made right by the Prince of Light. "Master, Master," I said over and over again. I couldn't wait to tell the others, and yet I could hardly move. My body was drained from the event of the weekend, but suddenly, now nothing else mattered. I looked at the spices and perfumes I had brought to anoint the body. Why, I had hardly remembered why I had come, but it didn't matter. He was alive. That was all that mattered, now or ever. It is the joy of that moment I have come to share with you. Share that you might share it too. Master, Master.